So, welcome everyone. This is one of three Fojo 40 minutes about Ukraine. And today it's my great pleasure and honor to welcome Anna Myroniuk, who is head of investigations at the Kyiv Independent. We're going to talk about your newspaper, your work, and of course, the war and its implications on journalism in Ukraine. I think many people already know Kyiv Independent, but could you just the same give us a brief introduction to your newsroom?
Sure. Nice meeting you. Thank you for having me. The Kyiv Independent is a startup media which was created in November 2021 after the entire team of the Kyiv Post, the predecessor of the Kyiv Independent, was fired for defending our editorial independence. The oligarch owner wanted to exert some influence and censorship in the newsroom, which we didn't accept, and we stood against that. For that, we were fired. But just a couple of days later, we decided to run our own media outlet, which later was named the Kyiv Independent. And that happened just 3 months before Russian full-scale invasion. And of course, right after the Russian full-scale invasion started, we gained new audiences, and now our website gets millions, from 3 to 5 millions of visitors per month. Something we couldn't have ever imagined starting this startup in November 2021.
Did I understand it correctly? It was actually all of the employees of the former Kyiv Post newsroom that left and instead started Kyiv Independent.
Yes, that's correct. We all were fired, the entire newsroom, including the managerial side, administrators, accountants, all people were fired. And then not the entire team stayed with us, but most of the employees of the Kyiv Post co-created the Kyiv Independent. Just a few decided not to join, but the majority stayed.
And if we go back to the day of the full-scale invasion, February 24th last year, what happened on that first day? What happened in the newsroom with you personally, and of course the staff? Could you take us back to that very first day of the invasion?
Sure. So to start, there was no, we didn't meet in the newsroom on that day. Something that we, of course, planned to do, but it never happened due to Russian full-scale invasion. So for me, the day was a very long day, probably as for everybody, and also for our editors who didn't even sleep that night. My experience was a little bit different because I went to bed at around 2 in the morning after having watched Volodymyr Zelensky, Ukraine's president, address to the public, to Ukrainians. So after having watched Ukraine's president address, I was, of course, worried. But the thing is that but evidently, I underestimated the threat because, by that time, Russian military buildup on Ukraine's borders have been ongoing, and there had been so many warning signs of Russian war threat that at some point I just stopped paying that much attention and started taking it with a grain of salt. So when Volodymyr Zelensky said that it's very dangerous, and he, after having listened to his address, I thought, well, this is dangerous. This seems serious, but well, what can I do? I'll go to bed. And I went to bed to be waken up in just a couple hours, closer to 5 a.m. by explosions. I woke up to the sounds of explosions that were very, very near. The first thing I did, I just dialed the number of my mother. I called her, and my mother lived in Bucha, which is a town next to Ukraine's capital, Kyiv, which is now infamous of Russian atrocities. And I called my mom to just inform her that the war had just started, and she was already awake. She said that she knows. She also heard the sounds of explosions. She said not to worry about her, that she will be okay, and that she will seek shelter in case of danger. I said that I loved her, and she said the same, and we just said goodbyes for now. And then immediately after I hung up the phone, Russian missile hit the nearby building that was just next to mine. The walls shook, my hands shook. It was very scary. The first thing I did immediately, I guess as a journalist, that's just a reflection, like just an immediate reaction that you have. I just took my phone and rushed to the balcony to take a picture of this mushroom-shaped smoke that was just near. And I took this picture. My hands had never shaken this much in my life. I was actually thinking that I can, just because my hands were so shaky that I couldn't even press, and take this picture. So I then realized that if the missiles are hitting that close next to my building, then probably it's a good sign of, taking the next step of evacuation. So I just grabbed my go bag, which was already prepared, as probably many people did in Ukraine. It just it consisted of a pair of jeans, 2 t-shirts, some underwear, some snacks, and that was it. So I just grabbed this go bag, my laptop, the chargers, and started to go out. When I got out of my building, I realized that the only road that was there was already full with the cars, and there was already a huge, massive traffic jam, and it was absolutely impossible to get out on any vehicle. No taxis, nothing, because it was all a huge. The only thing I was left with to walk. And I live outside of Kyiv, which means that, I live in a satellite kind of village. So I had to walk towards Kyiv. That's what I did. That was the only solution. I walked, and then I was very fortunate that a colleague of mine was passing by with his family members, and they picked me up at some point. And they gave me a lift, and we went to a safe place. There was a bomb shelter, and we started immediately working. So that's my kind of experience on that day. And then later on, I met with my friends, and we went to another bomb shelter. So basically, my day was just working in between of running. Sorry. Distracted. So my day was basically just walking in between of seeking shelter because of the constant missile strikes, and how we worked and how we organized our work in the newsroom. That was a huge challenge, because yet it was something inspiring, because everybody, all hands were on deck. There was no one who would say, sorry, like, I won't work today, I'm taking a day off. Under this tremendously difficult circumstance, under this pressure, under this fear, for the lives of your loved ones, relatives, and friends, the entire newsroom was working 24/7, with no rest, trying to simultaneously navigate some family issues, trying to see who to evacuate and where, and also simultaneously working to fill the website with the news. So what we did, we were just working, I was working from my phone as I was walking towards Kyiv. I was trying to write something, whatever I could on my phone. Some other people were writing from the underground where they hid from Russian missiles. Somebody was working from the bomb shelter. It was a huge challenge because the internet connection was, of course, very poor on that very day, also due to the circumstance. So we had to go around all these issues, like really managing family, also your safety and work. It was a lot, yet we managed. And our website got updated all the time. So it even went down at some point on 24th of February because our website had never at the time experienced that many visitors as on that day. And our programmers also had a big challenge to bring the website back on track and to help us run operations. So it was to cut it short. It was a very challenging day. Yet the way that we went about it, the way that the newsroom managed to carry on our work despite Russia's full-scale invasion and missiles just hitting buildings near you, is something that still gets me inspired, because I'm very proud to work side by side with these people.
And have you actually managed to update your website every day during the war, or have there been any interruptions?
No, there was no day when the site would be down. Of course, there were a few technical issues when the site would go down for a few minutes. It happened just a couple times, not often, and our programmers immediately brought the site back. So there was no day throughout all the difficult times that our website wouldn't have been updated.
That is truly impressive. And what would you say? I mean, for sure, safety, of course, for you and for everyone must be a big issue. But apart from that, what would you say have been the biggest challenges being a journalist in Ukraine during the full-scale war? That's now, I mean, it's been more than 14 months. It keeps on.
Well, apart from safety, I guess it's very challenging to just keep sane because it's difficult to cover the country that is at war while this is your country. It's not, a work trip somewhere where you're a foreign correspondent. You can come, that's your shift. It ends, and like as a foreign correspondent, you always know that this is a journey that will at some point end, and you'll be returned back to your respectable country, and somebody else will come in your place and carry on your work. So you will have this sort of rotation. In our case, there is no rotation whatsoever, because that is your country. And of course, you have some special attitude and some feelings towards what is happening. So, for example, I would say that it's very challenging to cover the areas that get affected by Russian war, for example, get shelled at, or Russian missiles get launched in this area where, for example, your friends and family members live, and you are, apart from doing your work covering this, you're also simultaneously wondering whether your loved ones and relatives and friends are safe. And of course, it is very challenging to report on the people you knew getting killed. That is something that is also a huge emotional burden, because well, there are, I lost colleagues and friends in Russia's war, soldier friends, journalist friends, and this is very difficult to report on their deaths because, of course, you are personally invested, you have some personal connection to them, and now you have to be a professional reporting on that, but also you have you are a human being, so it's hard for you to carry on with your work while having some emotions towards this fact.
Yeah, because you've actually had members of the staff of your newsroom that have turned into soldiers and who've lost their lives.
No, we have one member of our newsroom who turned to be a soldier, Artur Kornienko. He is a colleague of mine, a journalist who joined Ukrainian territorial defense on the very first day of Russian full-scale invasion. He just immediately decided that he wants to defend Ukraine, and he has been serving from the day one of Russian full-scale invasion. He's alive, everything is fine. I think you might be referring to a former partner of mine, a colleague with who I worked with for another media outlet in the past, who a year ago got killed on the front line, Alexander Makha.
I'm thinking that it is, of course, completely impossible for us on the outside to understand the conditions under which you work. But still, when the World Press Freedom Index was presented just the other day for this year, Ukraine has come out in a better position than last year. You are now at place 79, which is up several steps from last year. And this happened during the full-scale war, which is, I mean, it's not even, how is that even possible? There must be a lot of courageous journalists in the country fighting for press freedom and fighting for the conditions to produce quality journalism. What have you done?
Well, I must admit that I'm not as positive about these results as maybe some other people might be, because I do still see some significant challenges in press freedom in Ukraine at the moment. But let me first compliment the work of our colleagues and the Kyiv Independent too, on shedding light of on Russian atrocities and tirelessly and tirelessly reporting on war crimes during these difficult times for over a year. Of course, it is a huge challenge, and it does have mental toll on the reporters who are covering these topics. But simultaneously, I must admit that the situation with the freedom of press isn't ideal. It's far from ideal, in my personal opinion, because the martial law, which has been put in place when Russia unleashed its all-out war, it does limit freedom of press in many instances. I also see some newsrooms self-censoring themselves because of their stance on Russia's war, which I think is not the solution, because Ukraine is a democracy, and in a democracy, journalism exists to act as watchdog, and this function must be preserved even during the war, especially during the war, because there are so many ways where you can, as a representative of power, authority, you can abuse your power during the war, because it just allows you to, it brings you so many opportunities for that. So I believe that journalism must be even more active. Journalists must be even more active during the war. I just think that while talking about newsrooms that started self-censoring themselves, it is something that I've experienced, being there, working as a journalist in Ukraine, happening starting from the day one of the Russian all-out war, but ending closer to the end of summer. I think starting from September, journalists started realizing that you cannot, stop scrutinizing Ukrainian authorities despite amid the war, and you should, carry on the investigations not only of Russian war crimes but also of internal affairs, and because that is also vital in a democratic society, and actually it helps Ukraine, not damages Ukraine, because it eventually helps Ukraine to come out as a better country of this conflict. So that is to say that I started seeing this shift from self-censoring to actually taking a more proactive position on investigating the internal affairs. At some point in September last year, I would say. And we at the Kyiv Independent were actually pioneers of this, I would say, because we ran our investigation which shed light on alleged abuse of power and mismanagement in the International Legion, which is part of the Ukrainian army, as early as in August last year. And that was a brave move, because not many journalists were, well, none probably, were investigating the military at that time. Now we see more and more investigations on these matters coming out, and I'm very proud that Ukrainian journalists, under all the circumstances, are doing this work today. But there was, I must admit that there was a period of time, like the first half a year after Russian full-scale invasion started, when the journalists were, all focused on, I would say, rather covering Russian atrocities and Russian war crimes, what Russia was doing in Ukraine, killing Ukrainians, not internal affairs. But also on the other side, that was, I guess, a natural reaction to danger. As a journalist, you also tend to, to react upon something like that and shed light on that. But I just am happy that it shifted, and now we see more and more investigations coming out about something that happens within Ukraine, because it's, as I already said, in my opinion, it's vital for Ukraine, and it's in Ukraine's interest, because, well, by exposing some misconduct in the leadership, journalists are helping to fix these issues, to bring change, which is eventually and consequently good for Ukraine, good for the country.
And as you said, you were a pioneer on doing that investigation, and it got a lot of international attention and praise. How were the initial reactions inside the country when you did that investigation into the International Legion and their misconduct?
This is a two-part series. When the first part of the story came out in August, I guess that the reaction that we witnessed was rather, let's sweep it under the rug. So not reacting. I think the strategy of the people in power was to exercise silent treatment of this story and just not react anyhow whatsoever. The sources of ours came to us saying that the Ukraine's military intelligence was actually getting ready to sue us, which never happened, because I think they reconsidered and decided not to do it in the end. But yeah, there were some people coming to us and passing some information to us saying that some people in power aren't happy about our reporting. So we weren't receiving any direct threats or any direct, direct words of disapproval, but we received some indirect hints that indicated that the story wasn't received very well by the Ukrainian establishment and people.
What about the general public? How did they react?
Well, I think that the general public within Ukraine, in Ukraine, didn't care that much. I'll explain why. Because we are, first of all, an English language media publication, and our language of publication is English, and our audience is primarily foreign. So our audience is in the United States, United Kingdom, European Union. That is our primary audience. So even though the story got extensively covered by Ukrainian media outlets too, who picked up the story, and internationally, the story received a huge exposure. There were German media outlets, Spanish, Portuguese, you name it, Brazilian, I think, writing stories about our findings. Even though within Ukraine, I won't say that it, hit the nerve, because also I think the story was concerning foreigners. And I think, once again, for Ukrainians at that very moment, when there are so many difficulties they are facing, I think since it wasn't about them, it might have not evoked that huge of a reaction inside Ukraine. But outside Ukraine, it was a big story, and people did react on many levels, and especially in Poland, which is a country where one of the alleged masterminds of some crimes was born, and where he lived for years. Poland was also interested. But I should say that judging by the comments that we received on various social media platforms, the story was well received. And actually, our audience, members of our community, people reading us, complimented our courage and bravery, and many said that they actually now will convert into patrons of the Kyiv Independent just because of this story, because they see that the Kyiv Independent tries to do its best in terms of journalism and, preserve this watchdog function even despite the war. So there were we received many inspiring messages like that. Also, of course, there were a few messages, obviously, of people saying that we are helping Russian propaganda by doing stories like that. And there were other commentators saying, no, they are not. They are doing decent journalism. So there was a discussion in comments. But I would say that overall, the story was received way better than I expected, because I thought that it would have a huge backlash. But I was very glad to see that actually the overseas audience we have, the international audience we have, was very much ready for stories like that, meaning like they were saying that journalists are not to blame for writing these stories like that, for investigating, for scrutinizing, people doing mismanaging the relation, abusing power are to blame for what they're doing, not journalists.
It also really shows the independence of your newsroom doing that kind of a story. If we look generally on journalism about Ukraine and about the war, what is your view on journalism in general, either from foreign media or from also inside Ukraine? How are the journalists doing? Are they doing a good job, in your opinion?
I think that journalists at the moment are doing a very very good job in terms of covering Ukraine, which is something that we haven't had when Russia first invaded in 2014, because I see a very striking difference between what we had at the time in terms of international coverage and what we are experiencing today. Because back then in 2014, there were so many misconceptions about Ukraine. Ukraine was at times reported on from Kremlin point of view, for example, by the correspondents based in Moscow and covering Ukraine from Moscow, which is something that I think newsrooms owned as a mistake at some point and moved their newsrooms now to Kyiv, Ukraine's capital, to cover Ukraine. For example, New York Times and Washington Post opened their Kyiv branches to cover Russia's war against Ukraine. From here, having realized, I guess, that you have to be present here to understand the context, to have access to people, to surround yourself with what it is here, to really understand the country and cover it without bias. Without Russian bias in this context. That is something that improved. International coverage did improve throughout these years. It's just very unfortunate that for that to happen, Russia had to unleash all-out war against Ukraine, for the international media to finally realize that they might have been mistaken and to finally take action. As for the Ukrainian media, once again, something that inspires me much is that there are so many local media outlets, for example, from Kharkiv or other places, from Zaporizhia, who are doing a great job of covering something like these places are heavily shelled daily, Kherson, places like that. And local journalists are doing an amazing work of trying to carry on with their reporting, to cover Russia's war every single day by being at the war zone daily, because that's where you live. That is something that inspires me massively, because I really think that these journalists are very proud of the work they're doing. And also the thing is that Ukrainian journalism, if we're talking about the way that Ukrainian journalism operates at the moment, it's very important to stress that the journalism is massively affected in Ukraine by lack of money, because, for example, the TV channels in Ukraine, most of them are owned by oligarchs, for example, but the websites aren't. The majority of the websites have other means for survival. And for example, at the moment, some local media outlets are struggling with finding funds for to keep running their operations. Also, some of the journalists got conscripted to the military, like our colleague Artur Kornienko, who, well, in his case, it was his volunteer decision, but in many newsrooms, male correspondents or members of the newsrooms got conscripted to the military, which did affect their work a lot, because they lost their colleagues to the army, meaning that and it's hard to hire people at the moment, because once again, some people relocated and evacuated abroad. For example, young mothers with children, journalists, they left. That is also a challenge. So I guess under this circumstance, journalism that Ukrainian journalists do is on a decent level. Of course, there is room for improvement. Of course, I would wish to see more investigations into internal matters. But once again, that is something that has restarted to happen since September. And up until before Russian full-scale invasion, Ukrainian freedom of press, Ukrainian journalism, I would say, up until the Russian full-scale invasion, Ukrainian journalism was very up to date, meaning like we had great teams that were investigative teams that were doing great work in exposing corruption in the country, in reporting on oligarchy, in reporting on procurement, for example, public procurement, state funds, etc., etc. So I'm glad to see that is something that is shifting back to what we had before Russian full-scale invasion. But many challenges remain. As I said, many newsrooms are understaffed. Of course, reporting on Russian war against Ukraine in your own country does have a mental toll on you. So many journalists are just tired because you don't have vacations. That's not something, that's a luxury at the moment. And, this work right now is ongoing. It's 24/7 job, which doesn't really provide time off or much of time off. So that's a challenge.
And how do you manage to stay mentally sane and keep going under these circumstances?
Well, it's difficult. How do I manage? I guess at times when I feel down, I try to remind myself why I'm doing this and ask myself whether I would do something else. And normally the answer is no, I don't even see myself doing something else but this. And of course I get tired. Of course I'm a human being. Of course it's sometimes I feel down and, sometimes I just question myself, what's next? Or when I don't see reaction, for example, to stories that I write, or it's also very disappointing. For example, with the International Legion, unfortunately, we didn't see reaction, and the people in question of our story, people subject to our investigation, are still there, still serving, and that is something that is a huge disappointment for me as a journalist. So, of course, things like that affect you, and in my case, yeah, there were moments when I was very emotional and questioning, my work, etc. But whenever it happens, I just try to remind myself the purpose, which is like greater than just one story, and I try to stick to this thought, and that's something that helps me to carry on.
And I think there's many of us grateful that you do have the courage and strength to carry on. So thank you very much. And thank you for sharing and telling us your story and the story of Kyiv Independent during these terrible 14 months.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you to all of you who've been listening in on us today. Do feel free to watch again if you like to on fojo.academy, or otherwise, see you next time.